Palace of Mirrors, Season 1, Episode 9, The Smile in the Sword. How do you tell a story? Darien didn't know when he had learned. Had it been when he was 15 and Kathy told him the story of the knight who fought her way to the center of the world tree, so that she could capture a vial of the pure gold sap said to heal any wound? Had it been when he was 10, and he read Tale of the Twin Blades, a collection of poems that together told the story of star-crossed lovers, one a priest sworn to the palace, and the other a hired assassin who had never known love? Had it been when he was 5, and his sister and he played knights and pirates? They had created their own stories together, stories that had sometimes seemed more real than their hard lives in the dirt. Or had it been earlier still? The day Darien was born. The day his mother held him briefly in her arms and gave him a name, an impossible name, a name filled with promise and history and hope. The day she had died, the wind of a winter storm, her funeral dirge. Our tractor broke down a week ago, Darien began. I drew the short straw. So when my brothers got to stay and work the farm, I got sent out on the road to the city. I got slowed by the rains, and I knew that if I couldn't get the parts back in time, we wouldn't be able to grow enough food to make it through another winter. So I took a shortcut. Bluebeard shook his head. An old captain I once knew used to say that shortcuts lead to deep wounds. Darien faltered at the interruption, but managed to collect his thoughts with a breath. I got lost out there and wandered into some ruins. I don't think I was too far away from the city, but I might as well have been on another planet. Then a snowstorm struck, and I had to take shelter in one of the ancient buildings. I got bored, waiting for the storm to end, so I began to explore. In the basement, I found a secret passage that led to a room filled with chests of gold and jewels. I found Knight in that room, leaning up in a corner. The storm ended, I found my way out of the building, and I continued to the city where I got the parts for the tractor. Darien shrugged as nonchalantly as he could manage. Bluebeard peered at him for a long moment. That's what you're going with, he sounded bemused. That's how I found the sword. Isn't that what you said you wanted? The story of how I found it? The captain leaned on the desk, his eye intent on Darien's face. Let me guess. You can lead me to this building where you found a room full of treasure. Is that how you plan to bargain for your freedom? I don't know if I should be impressed with your audacity or insulted that you think I'm such a fool. Darien swallowed. He felt a chill from the sheen of sweat on his face, but resisted the urge to wipe it away. He did not let himself flinch, though all he wanted to do was hide. He had nowhere to go. He could only hope to stay the course he had set himself. I saw your storeroom. He kept his voice level. Old clothes, used toys, outdated farm machinery. You're not getting anything worth keeping on this world. Certainly, it can't be enough to pay your crew. I saw enough treasure in the room where I found this sword for you to be king of the pirates yourself. Bluebeard snorted. They wouldn't have me as their leader even if I filled my entire ship with gold and jewels. Fair enough, said Darien. But I found this sword in that room, and you said it yourself. You've never seen a finer blade. Don't you want to know the real story of the sword? It's got to be there, in that room, waiting for you to come and find it. Darien stood and reached his hand across the desk. I give you my word. Set me free, and I'll show you where I found Knight. Bluebeard seized Darien's hand. His fingers felt like iron, cold and rough with time. Darien couldn't have pulled his hand back if he wanted to change his mind. The captain had him now, had him bound, had him, and would do with him what he willed. Understand me. I am no fool. I know what little truth your words hold. Should I desire it, I will give you the chance to hang yourself with that promise. For now, we will pretend you have not lied to me. Because you have given me some small respite from the tedium I currently face, I will give you a berth on my ship. Darien gaped. What? Bluebeard smiled at Darien's shocked expression. Welcome to the crew. The pay is almost nothing, the working conditions will be difficult, and your fellow crewmates are, well, you'll see soon enough, I'm sure. Bluebeard released Darien's hand, stood, and sheathed Knight. He stepped around the desk toward the door. Wait, what about your sword? Darien held it out. Keep it. Every member of my crew carries a sword. He paused at the door and looked over his shoulder. Oh, I should say, the sword's name is Linda. Do try to take good care of it for me. Bluebeard closed the door behind him and headed into the storage room. Knight swung from the scabbard at the captain's side, and Darien felt a moment of pity for the sword. For hundreds of years it had been trapped under the earth alone, with nothing but screens and speakers to show it that the world still turned and people still lived and died. All his life, Darien had believed himself tethered to the farm, to his father and family, but he had still been able to see the clouded sky and feel the wind on his skin. He'd had the freedom to explore, if only the acres of his farm. Knight had never even had that. It hadn't even been able to pace the small room beneath the earth where someone, once long ago, had left it. Even now, free from that prison, Knight had to go where Darien went. He shook his head. No. Knight swung at Bluebeard's side now. Laughter broke the uneasy sleep that Darien had fallen into on the floor of the office. He fumbled for Knight, but the hilt felt wrong. Darien blinked and let the room come into focus. A single lamp lit the office with a warm orange light, but white light spilled in from the storeroom beyond. 5 pirates sat in a circle around the card table, Bluebeard not among them. Glass bottles lay scattered across the floor. Darien remembered, his stomach sinking, why the sword felt wrong. Ha! That's another hand for me! The fates favor me tonight! The elaborately dressed pirate, the one who had apologized for suggesting the pirates hang Darien, reached across the table and slid a pile of coins his way. He stood out in his colorful clothing, as though he belonged to a different crew from the other pirates. The fates don't give 2 shits about you, gent. You're just cheating, said a man shaped like a barrel of ale. Beady eyes glared out of a balding, rotund head. Gent smiled wide. Who here isn't? For a moment the table remained silent, and then laughter broke out. He has a point, Trollbreath, Fantasia spoke in a voice as rich and warm as fire. You've been doing an especially bad job of it. I can see the cards up those baggy sleeves of yours. Her dark eyes gave less light than midnight, and her shadowy hair fell in waves to her shoulders. Darien found himself transfixed. She smiled as she spoke. It should have magnified her beauty, like a light shining out the window in a cold storm. Instead, it sent a shiver down Darien's spine. Her smile reminded him less of a light in the window, and more of the glint of the guns the soldiers had carried into Mariala's home. Trollbreath waved a fat hand dismissively at her. He swayed in his seat, a bottle tightly held in his other hand. What will you know about it? You're just, Fantasia's face froze. Belatedly, Trollbreath noticed the change that had come over Fantasia and broke off. His eyes widened, and he began to shake his head back and forth. A hush fell across the table. Fantasia's smile remained, but it was the remnants of a building still smoking. Her eyes pinned Trollbreath, who squirmed like a trapped insect. Sweat beaded his forehead and rolled down his jowls. He wiped ineffectively at his face, and his mouth opened and closed soundlessly. You were saying? Now, Fantasia, now, you know. Her smile sharpened. What do I know? I didn't mean nothing by it. I have too much booze in my head and too few brains, Gent snorted. This is getting good. 1 minute Fantasia sat across from Trollbreath, and in the next she stood looming over the table, a drawn sword in her hand. Most of the pirates rose and stepped back from the table, but Trollbreath remained, trapped by Fantasia's gaze. I ain't gonna fight you. I didn't mean nothing, and you know it. His eyes darted from her sword to her face. You know it, Fantasia. Only one other pirate, the one with the tattooed face, remained sitting. He took a drink and looked up at Fantasia with a roll of his eyes. He took a deep breath, set down his bottle, and took her elbow in his hand. Her attention snapped to him. No trace of a smile remained on her face, but the man held her gaze and did not flinch. His hand did not so much as stray to the hilt of his sword. He faced her down like a statue facing down a storm. Leave it, Fantasia. Remove your hand, Death Mask. He did not take his hand from her elbow. Remove your hand or I shall do it for you. For a tense moment, Darien thought maybe the tattooed pirate would not release Fantasia. Then, with a nearly imperceptible sigh, Death Mask moved his hand back to his side. Even then, he did not reach for his sword or back away. He kept his eyes on hers. Bluebeard won't be happy to hear you started another fight. Fantasia laughed, but there was a brittle edge to it. I'm not afraid of the old man. Death Mask shrugged. You may not be afraid of him, but you should be. I've known many men and women, young and old both. I've known none stronger than Bluebeard. He will continue after you have fallen to the weaker circle. Fantasia leaned down so that her face was inches from Death Mask. Her hair fell like shadows to either side of his face. She spoke in a hushed voice that didn't make it through the window to Darien, but her words made the pirate flinch, as her sword had not. He stood abruptly, his chair shrieking back, and turned to leave the room. You're a coward, she called after him, smiling. You'll die a coward, and you'll never see that stronger circle you're all babbling on about. Death Mask faltered for a step, but continued on without looking back. Trollbreath, who had taken advantage of the exchange to sidle towards the exit, froze when Fantasia's eyes turned back on him. He let out a great sigh, looked up at Fantasia for a brief moment, and then stared down at his shuffling feet. He stood between her and the window. Had he been a larger man, Fantasia might never have looked past him to see Darien. Had he been a braver man, Fantasia might have been too wary to turn her attention to Darien. Had Darien been a smarter man, he might have been hidden in the shadows behind Bluebeard's desk. Well, well. She swung her sword back and forth like a Ragnar cat swishing its tail. Bluebeard's latest stray. Darien's skin crawled, and it was all he could do to keep from twitching into the shadows. But he knew from the look on Fantasia's face that it would be pointless. With a heaving sigh, Darien stepped up to the window. He thought if he met her eyes he would piss himself, so he looked down and away. She studied him as though he were an animal caught in a trap. She laughed, and in any other circumstance the sound would have stirred his heart. The melody of her voice could have matched his sister's violin. Trollbreath fidgeted uneasily between them. So you're not gonna kill me? He rubbed his short neck and shivered. Fantasia spared him a single glance and lazily swatted him with the flat of her sword. He fell to the floor with a wail and scrambled away like a rat. He's handsome, don't you think? She winked at Gent over her shoulder. Hard to say. He looks like he's been wearing the same set of clothes for days on end. You need to look beyond the surface, Gent. Down in the blood and guts is where it really matters. Those things may matter, but I'd rather not look at them. They upset my constitution. Fantasia stepped toward the window, and Darien swallowed hard. Look at that, she said. He can't even meet my eyes. Maybe he has a crush on me. Gent shrugged and muttered, Poor bastard. A shadow passed over Fantasia's face, but she didn't turn away from Darien. What's your name, farm boy? Darien glanced up, but stopped short of her eyes. Darien. Darien. She rolled his name across her tongue. Darien, the great admiral of the guard. Such a noble name. It doesn't quite suit you, though, does it? Have you ever been great at anything, I wonder? Down here, on this cold gray world? The surface of her sword reflected her smile, and twisted it into something stretched and unnatural. But Darien thought it fit her better than her real face and her real smile. She reached a hand out and touched the window between them. Darien backed up and hit Bluebeard's desk. Papers avalanched out across the floor at his feet. He didn't stop. He moved back around the desk until he had his back up against the bookshelves. The leather covers comforted him. The scent of books, leather and paper and dust filled his lungs and reminded him of the trunk Kathy had kept under her bed. In that trunk she'd kept all her books, all the books in the world as far as Darien had known when he was a little boy. Fantasia's smile grew, and now the expression on her face nearly matched her reflection. It had grown into something grotesque. The sight of Darien cowering in the back of the room seemed to have woken something that had only ever been fitfully sleeping within her. Darien took the hilt of the sword Bluebeard had given him into his hand. The worn leather grip wasn't so different from the books at his back. A noble name and a noble sword. Maybe there's more to you than meets the eye. She turned away and returned to the table. She sheathed her sword and pulled her chair out. Darien sighed and shook out the arm that had been tensed on the handle of the sword. He closed his eyes, relief flooding through him as though he had been parched and finally given a long drink of cool water. Still, can I know what Bluebeard sees in you if I don't take a closer look? Fantasia covered the space in heartbeats, and the creak of the opening door sounded louder than pebbles tumbling into the darkness of the ravine. Her silhouette stood framed in the open door. She gestured for Darien to step out. Her smile left no room for disobedience, yet made that obedience an act of heart-thundering terror. Gent and the other remaining pirate, a gaunt figure with a sunken face, began to yell for Fantasia to stop. All Darien heard was his pulse, and all he could think was that he didn't want that sound to stop. His mouth had grown so dry that he struggled to open it to catch a breath. Silence! Fantasia's voice cut through the pirates and through Darien's pulse. I'll do what I want. If you want to stop me, you'll have to come and make me. Neither Gent nor the other pirate moved. The room grew still and silent. Metal sang when Fantasia drew one of the swords crossed on her back. It moved with her arm, as though it were a part of her, and not lifeless metal. She drew it forward and pointed it at Darien's heart with the practiced accuracy of a killer. Draw! Darien gaped at the word, which sounded like nonsense to his ears. Fantasia laughed, soft and gentle and cold as ice. Draw your sword. I won't have any fun if you just stand there. Darien stood, his heart thundering so hard it hurt his chest. His legs shook beneath him. He had tried for so long to avoid Fantasia's eyes, but now he couldn't look away. They held him, like the night holding the wind. He couldn't move. He couldn't even open his mouth to plead for his life. Draw your sword. Darien's hand moved on its own accord. He gripped Bluebeard's sword. The leather felt smooth and warm. It was the books in Kathy's chest and Mariala's hand in his. He thought of Bluebeard, telling him that once every great sword had a name, and he thought of Kathy telling him once that every name held a story. How many nights had she told him stories in a voice as smooth as the leather beneath his hand? How many nights had he tucked her in when she fell asleep before the story's end? He drew Bluebeard's sword. Linda, that had been the name the captain had given it. What story did that name hold? Darien's legs stopped shaking. His heart stilled. He steadied the blade, and he looked up and met Fantasia's eyes. As she took in his stance, the smile faded from her face, and her eyes narrowed. A shiver went down his spine. He held the sword and waited. Fantasia moved, and it was the shadows racing into a suddenly dark room. Darien had no time to think, no time to plan his movement, no time to do anything but react. His sword just managed to get into the right place to block the strike, but the force of the blow drove him back a step and sent his bones reverberating. All the amusement had evaporated from Fantasia's face. Only rage remained, raw and hungry and desperate. Luck won't save you, little farm rat. She drove forward and struck again and again and again. Her attacks came faster than snow in a blizzard. One by one, not knowing what he did or how he did it, Darien turned her blows aside. Sweat stung his eyes, and the sword in his hands grew heavier with every swing. It grew heavier than anything Darien had ever held, but he knew that if he lowered it even once, she would slice him open. He stumbled back a step, and then another, and then fell to his knees gasping. His arms ached with the weight of the sword and Fantasia's fury. He could no longer move the blade. Could only hold it impotently over his head. Now he understood. He hadn't been lucky. He hadn't found a well of mysterious skill like a hero from one of Kathy's stories. Fantasia had been toying with him. She pulled back now, no sign of exertion on her beautiful face. "You've disgraced that sword." She knelt down and brushed her fingers down his cheek. "I'm going to kill you now." Her hushed voice carried a gentleness that shocked Darien. He wondered where it came from. Had there been some moment in her life, forgotten in all but the deepest part of her, when she had known what it meant to be gentle? Darien pushed himself to his feet. He tried to think of heroic words, but he could only think how very weary he felt. He could only stand, sword in front of him, and wait for what would come. He tried to ignore the terrible weight of the blade in his hand, and the terrible implication of the blade Fantasia wielded. He tried to ignore the sweat stinging his eyes. He tried to ignore the memory of the promise he'd made Mariala's mother. Tears mixed with the sweat. Still, he held the sword. He would not let it drop. Fantasia drew her second sword. Those black eyes of hers were like ice, so long frozen it had forgotten the summer sun. She wove her swords about her, threads of silver shining in the air. She moved to strike. A discordant clash of metal and a roar, and Fantasia fell back to the floor in a tumble. Bluebeard stood between them, where a moment before there had been nothing but steel. Fantasia stared up at him, her already white face growing pale. Bluebeard's shadow fell heavy over her. "This is finished!" Bluebeard's voice roared. "All of you, return to the ship!" Fantasia remained, prone on the floor. Her sword scattered beside her. She looked up at Bluebeard with something like fear, but also with defiance. "If you try to kill me, I won't make it easy for you, old man." "Oh," Bluebeard smiled. "I would expect nothing less from you, Fantasia." He knelt down in front of her, so that their eyes were level. "If you continue to disobey me, I will have no choice. Get out of my sight." She sheathed her swords and skulked into the shadows. Darien dropped his sword from a numb hand and collapsed to the floor beside it. Bluebeard turned and looked down at the boy and the sword on the floor. He put a hand, solid as sun-warmed stone, on Darien's shoulder and pulled him up. With his foot, he flipped the fallen sword off the floor and caught it in a smooth motion. "It would not do to leave this lying on the ground." Lesson 1. Treat your sword with respect. It is no mere weapon, no mere tool. It is your constant ally. Keep it close, and it shall keep you safe. Darien took the sword, sneaking a glance at Knight as he did so. If it weren't for that strange talking blade, he would not be here. If it weren't for that sword, he might be on his way to rescue Mariala now. The jeweled eyes on the hilt glimmered, but Darien did not know what the sword wanted to convey. Thanks again to everyone for listening. If you like what I'm doing, and you haven't yet, it's a huge help if you rate and review the show on whatever platform you're listening. In 2 weeks, on the 10th episode of Palace of Mirrors, the story shifts for the first time to focus on Mariala.